This is College Matters from the Chronicle.
The greatest danger that faces higher education is this transactional tendency, that everything is about an exchange that ultimately is economic and not what education should be, which is transformational.
When Hampshire College announced last month that it would close its doors for good in December, a palpable sense of loss spread across higher education. The small college in Amherst, Massachusetts, now enrolls only about 625 people, but it has earned an outsized reputation as a place designed for students to pursue their passions. Hampshire is also known for helping to produce one of the nation's best-known documentary filmmakers, Ken Burns. With films about the Civil War, baseball, and the American Revolution, Burns has brought to life the story of the country in all of its conflict and complexity. He has also, in recent years, led fundraising efforts to save his alma mater. Today on the show, we'll talk with Burns about Hampshire's closure, and we'll get his take on political efforts to restrict how history is taught in the nation's colleges and universities. Ken Burns, welcome to College Matters.
Great to be with you. Thank you.
Well, I wanted to talk to you today because you're a proud alumnus of Hampshire College, which unfortunately announced that it plans to close soon. You and others have worked very hard to save this place, but it just didn't work out. This was a very small college, and it existed for less than 60 years. But my impression is that it was a life-changing institution for a lot of people, including you. Can you talk about what you feel like we've lost here?
Yeah, it may be a small college, but I think to the people who went through it, it's been utterly transformative. We wouldn't be talking here if I didn't go to Hampshire College. I don't recognize the person who entered in September of 71 and who graduated in the spring of 75. It rearranged all of my molecules. And the college itself, in a larger sense, has been hugely influential. Its innovations have been adopted a la carte by almost every higher education institution that I've ever been aware of. What makes Hampshire so special is that it constantly innovated and improved and experimented. And particularly now when higher education is so challenged, where we are distracted by that which is transactional rather than transformational, when there are forces from within that are corrupting it and forces from without, political forces that are trying to exert some sort of control. The crown jewel of this American experiment, our higher education, is really under assault, and we would do well to sort of have a laboratory of experimentation, have a laboratory of innovation going that would permit us to sort of outrun the demons that we've inherited. And so while for me it's utterly transformational, I think in ways that the rest of the community doesn't really fully understand, Hampshire has been utterly transformational as well.
You mentioned that it's been highly influential. At the same time, it was a bit of an outlier, or is a bit of an outlier institution. Students designed their own majors. Students receive narrative evaluations rather than grades. Some other colleges do that, but it's still not the norm. And everyone does this senior capstone project, which is a big signature piece of the Hampshire experience. It's in a lot of ways the opposite of a cookie-cutter vocational type of college that leads supposedly to a very particular job. And that speaks to, I think, a broader debate we're having in this country. When we talk to students today, a lot of them are very concerned about what are going to be the outcomes of this expense that I put into college? You know, can I be assured that I'll have a career in this very disorienting age? And I wonder whether you have any thoughts on whether Hampshire's demise in any way indicates that that feeling has to some degree won the day.
I think in some ways what you reflect is something that is part of this transactional problem, that the whole point of it is to get a job and that's it. The pursuit of happiness, which is at the last phrase of the sentence, that is the animating sentence of our republic, was not about the pursuit of money or objects in a marketplace of things, but about lifelong learning. The founders felt that if we were more virtuous, if we knew more things, that we would then be worthy, both spiritually as well as politically, of the gift of citizenship. And that is an important thing that's been lost, I think. This idea that what I'm doing is preparing to get a job at a certain figure of income. Hampshire was, I would not say an outlier. Its model is very similar in some ways to a graduate school experience in which you are assembling faculty to figure out a problem and then, solve the problem and present the outcome of that in whatever way it form. A documentary film, a paper, a laboratory experiment. The sciences were equally as important, if not more so, than the arts and humanities to the Hampshire experience. And I have many, many friends that I went to school with who excelled, and Hampshire was the difference between just having a career, which the poet laureate Robert Penn Warren told me was death, to having a professional life in which you are directing yourself. And there was an energy to the Hampshire experience that gave us agency over not only the choices we were making as we were going through, and incredibly rigorous, much more difficult. I worried at the end of my time there whether this had been some sort of outlier. And so I took a course at Amherst College, which we could do as part of the 5-college consortium of Mount Holyoke Smith and the University of Massachusetts, that required a paper a week and a grade. And I got an A. So I knew that Hampshire had prepared me in lots of ways. And then my professional life, the arc of my professional life, is the proof of the pudding for at least one individual of that Hampshire education. And so, instead of apprenticing myself to some film company, I started my own. We just celebrated our 50th year of incorporation. I've made 40 films that have been broadcast nationally on public broadcasting that are among the highest rated. And more importantly, I've been the master of these things. Every one of the films has been a director's cut. All of that comes from a path that Hampshire exposed to me, a path that I had to take, obviously, but a path that Hampshire permitted me to see. And I just ran for that daylight.
There are challenges that are particular to Hampshire, and then there are larger forces at work here. We talk a lot and have been talking a lot about the demographic cliff, this point at which I think we're at, where the number of teenagers graduating from high school is expected to decline for at least the next 15 years. That's going to put a lot of pressure on small colleges. But I wonder, do you put any blame at the feet of Hampshire's board or administration for things turning out as they did?
Not at all. In fact, the board and particularly the administration, particularly our president, Jen Chrysler, have been heroic in what they've been able to do. And I thought, and I think they did too, as recently as 3 or 4 months ago, a lot of things happened. We had designed a plan. What was so inspirational is that in the midst of this existential crisis that began in the late winter, spring of 2019, not knowing that COVID was around the corner, which would have its own peculiar things, we were not only figuring out a plan and a reasonable plan for survival, but had begun to re-innovate, to double down not only on the original recipe, but to design learning collaboratives and allowing the school across all disciplines to address urgent challenges. It was exhilarating, and I wanted to go back to college. The demographic stuff was always there. And then I think as it came up, we had a series of unfortunate things, is that there were newspaper reports within the educational community and larger newspaper outlets that were sort of thrilled to report our deaths, even though we were seeing huge rises beyond our expectation for a couple of years in new enrollments. And that set us on this positive sense of course, but then we were kind of worn down by the constant drumbeat that we were dying. And there's no parent that wants to send their kids to a place that they pick up the newspaper and say, oh, it's dying, and no matter what we could say. So then after a couple of years of extraordinary admissions growth, it began to decline, and then other cascading things, banks calling loans, things like that, contributed to this immediate crisis of having to at least teach out at the end of the year and then figure out what Hampshire, both physically and in spirit, means. Is it a laboratory? Does it continue as a laboratory of innovation and experimentation, just not dependent? And we know this model of liberal arts students attending and being dependent on tuition is not going to work at this moment, particularly not for Hampshire, and as your excellent question suggests, particularly not for many, many hundreds of small liberal arts schools. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that that transactional aspect rather than transformational aspect of education has also insinuated it in. And so people are looking for the confidence they think comes from brand names.
This is going to sound a little granular for you, Ken, but just to set up the question, looking at what the administration was faced with, I think they said that they pretty well concluded in the spring that this wasn't going to work out. They'd hoped for 300 students this semester. They ended up with somewhere around 170. I keep thinking about those new students that were recruited. And I wonder if you have thoughts on that. Was it wrong for the college to recruit new students knowing that the survival was so tenuous?
No, not at all, because we were confident that we would with this plan, and we would have. But as I said, there were outside forces that were reporting our death every 3 or 4 months. And so after 2 years of exceeding our expectations and our goals about enrollment, it began to decline precipitously because we couldn't offset the kind of negative stories about it. There was just no way that we could show the figures. We could see the extent of the alumni involvement and contribution. You could see the amazing work the students were doing. But on a more, if you're going to say granular level, I went to Hampshire and spent the day there on Sunday. And it was sad. It was a long time ago that I entered, 55 years ago, that I entered. And I went with a friend who had come the same day that I had, and we've stayed and remained close friends. He is a psychiatrist and an extraordinary artist, to give you an idea of the kind of what comes out the other end of a Hampshire education. But what was so amazing and inspiriting and positive is just how amazing the students were. They were sad but resilient, determined, those ones, to finish the thing, and the college is endeavoring to find and place those students who did take a leap of faith. But no, you're not going to do this. We were going to fight for this vision of something free of these desultory aspects of higher education. And we succeeded for a really long time. I think everybody involved, including those students, I'm sure there's sadness, I'm sure there's anger, all the stages of grief that we will go through, but there is an extraordinary sense of pride that we were willing to do something outside of the norm, and the extraordinary human beings that have come out of it today. I mean, it would just, when I was there meeting some of these kids, they were as excited about the possibilities of their work and where they were headed as I remember we were as we entered with all the fresh energy of a brand new college. I came the second year of its existence.
Stick around. We'll be back in a minute. When it comes to the college classroom, many teachers need all the help they can get. From AI to evaluations to administrative oversight, teachers are dealing with a lot. So let the Chronicle's Beth McMurtry and her teaching newsletter give you a hand. Each week, Beth taps the teaching community to offer insights so that teachers can do their jobs better. Sign up for free at chronicle.com/get-newsletters. I think one of the things I always try to do as a journalist, Ken, is try to figure out what do these small events all add up to. And Hampshire is a significant event in the lives of the people who went there like yourself. But one of your great gifts as a filmmaker is to assemble sometimes disparate bits of history to arrive at some deeper revelation or truth about the world as it exists today. If you were to do that relative to this story, what is the larger story that this Hampshire College situation fits into?
I would push back a little bit. I don't think I assemble the group of stories in order to make a point. I assemble a group of stories to allow them to speak and say what they are, to call balls and strikes about the events, and to do so with a kind of rigorous scholarship and journalistic integrity. I think what happens is that we often stray from that path. And so we want to collect a few examples and then make a therefore this means. And I don't think that's the realm of journalism. It maybe is the realm of opinion and editorial, and that's okay. We have a First Amendment. Everybody's entitled to their opinion. I think I go back to what I said. The greatest danger that faces higher education, regardless of Hampshire, is this transactional tendency that everything is about an exchange that ultimately is economic and not what education should be, which is transformational. This has always been swimming around this story since the beginning. How could it not? That's what human beings are like. But we have created what is the envy of the entire world in our system of higher education and have produced extraordinary things that have transformed the lives of not only the citizens of this republic, but of the entire world. And we have begun, I think, to lose sight of that goal. It may be protecting one's endowment. It may be just the brand name aspect of it. These places are still hugely transformational for most people that go through. But now as these pressures and exigencies of the current moment exert from within and without, as the demographic things that we've been discussing today create the difficulties, particularly for the smaller institutions, we are only obligated to take stock, not necessarily to decide, therefore, QED, this. I think our biggest responsibility, and one of my greatest disappointments in the coverage of Hampshire's situation for the last 6-7 years, has been the overwhelming desire, the almost palpable desire to write the obituary that finally, they got to write a couple of weeks ago. And that was incredibly disappointing. You could speak to, credible journalists and talk about all of the things, the high, rising, beyond expectations. But again, all that's brought up is, is this honesty if you're bringing in people and you don't know if it's going to work?
Well, it wasn't just journalists raising concerns. It was their accrediting agency and an independent auditor.
Yeah, no, I know. But you could easily ask every bride and groom, half of all marriages end in divorce. Are you really doing a favor to yourselves and to your offspring to get married? We're in the business of looking forward and hope, and Hampshire tried to do that. And yeah, we ran into a buzzsaw. A lot of those things were self-fulfilling. Once you lose that momentum of a rise in applications and enrollment, as we were just so thrilled for the first couple of years of our plan, then, you're going to have problems with accreditation. You're going to have problems with the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. You're going to have problems with the banks. So These are not things that we foresaw. But I think there is I think everybody within the community, journalistically, whose beat is education, and all the other colleges that may be thriving or those that are in peril, need to actually, quoting Arthur Miller, attention must be paid to this story.
You said something interesting just now, Ken, about your role as a documentarian as you see it, positioning history to essentially speak for itself. I don't see you as a stenographer either, though. Do you not feel that by the choices that you make as a filmmaker that you are in any way trying to extract some meaning or grander themes?
It's a good question. It's at the heart of everything. It actually harks back to my first day at Hampshire when we were discussing objectivity and subjectivity in filmmaking. There's no objectivity. Everything is a variety of subjectivities. What I collect and what I choose to show, making a film, for example, most recently on the American Revolution, we have 400 hours of material we collected to end up as 12 hours. That's a great deal of distillation. And you're absolutely right. In that distillation, there is, of course, the imposition of interest. It's a military story. It's a social story. We're interested in Native Americans, but we're not interested in dictating a kind of, therefore, QED, that this is what you should take out of it. There is in art the ability to assemble a lot of things in which the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And what you look for is not necessarily not on intentional. It's not, well, I'm not trying to claim this is all by accident, but you do have these collisions of free electrons that do things. And if you say the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, if the sum of the parts are here, we've got to examine what that is. For me as a filmmaker, that's what art does. For somebody else, it might be about faith, it may be about love, it may be about reason, whatever it might be, that produces this strange calculus where 1 and 1 equals 3. But you're not driving it. There's not a kind of subscribing to a particular fashion of historiography, or there's some philosophy of how you see it. You want to collect as many, and this is Hampshire, as many perspectives and modes of inquiry, they would call it, and then permit all of them to coexist within some sort of structure. It's a different kind of architecture, but we're not interested in putting our thumb on the scale of meaning in one way or the other. Stuff will come out of it for me. Stuff might come out of it for you as a viewer, other people, and the success of that particular film, The American Revolution, is incalculable in terms of the idea that it's sponsored. But it should be just about where did we come from, particularly now as we're approaching 250, where did we come from, and what can we learn from our origin story that might help us negotiate choppy seas right now.
I think so much of the debate happening in the country right now, both at the K-12 level, but also in higher education regarding history specifically, is this notion of concern that professors are putting their thumbs on the scale, that they not only want to convey history to students, but tell them how to feel about it. And this has led to a number of states putting restrictions on how history is taught in public colleges across the country. There are more than 20 states now that have laws restricting university curricula in some way. They're banning what they're calling divisive concepts, which often means limiting what professors can teach about race, which has been a topic that you've made so many films that are related to. What do you make of these types of restrictions generally?
Well, I don't think they're originating from some professors putting their thumb on the scales. I think they're originating from the really reprehensible culture wars that people lead. Our Latin motto of the United States is e pluribus unum, out of many one. And it is in the interests of many people to advance themselves politically, to create a them. There's only us. There's only us. That's why I make films about the U.S., but I make films about us. There's only us. And so I think that this idea that it originates in bad teachers imposing their political will is crazy. There are people who are allowed, and colleges particularly should be laboratories of all sorts of diverse points of view. If you're afraid of the past, then you are, as Thomas Jefferson anticipated, interested in keeping people uninformed, superstitious, distracted by conspiracies. And that's the goal of an authoritarian. He says, right after the pursuit of happiness phrase, all experience has shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable. It's not hard to parse. It just means heretofore everybody's been under an authoritarian rule and been susceptible to superstition and conspiracy and mis and disinformation, and that we're creating this new thing, citizens who have to be exposed to everything. And it's only despots that fear the exposure to everything. Nobody's turned into anything by any college. And so this is a red herring to pursue. The thing is, a political system that would tolerate the idea that you could remove, as they did at the Naval Academy, books by Maya Angelou and a biography of Jackie Robinson, and leave in 2 copies of Mein Kampf.
I'm also curious about the practicality of these sorts of restrictions, Ken. In Florida, for example, one of the laws says we don't want anybody to be made to feel guilty today for racial injustices that happened in the past. First of all, I don't know how you measure how students are going to feel about any given content. But secondly, it's got me wondering if somebody had come to Ken Burns and said, we'd like you to make a documentary about the Civil War or the Civil Rights Movement, but we want to ensure that no one feels like they're personally responsible for any past racial injustice. Do you think you could ever work as a filmmaker within the restrictions that are being placed upon some of these professors?
Both you and I and anyone else who might choose to listen to this aren't getting out of this alive. That's the bad news I have to tell you. None of us are getting out of this alive. The stories of the human project are complex, dark, exhilaratingly inspirational, and all of those things. And you can't have one without the other. It's like if you call balls and strikes, if you want this highlight reel where Babe Ruth only hits home runs, you're mired in Babe Ruth struck out more times than he hit home runs. He only comes up once every 9 times at bat. So who are the other 8 people? Where did they come from? What did they do? When did they strike out? When did they hit home runs? The last World Series was decided not by the big, heavily paid stars, but by a second baseman. Mm-hmm. This is what the story is. Everybody likes a complicated story. Conservatives, moderates, liberals, everybody wants a story that isn't soft. So we're supposed to understand that Yellowstone is the conservative, series that they love. And it's unbelievably complicated. Unbelievably complicated at every level. And so I think that we do a disservice to ourselves when we think that we can in any way trim the sails of what actually happened and not just call balls and strikes, because you don't give people a chance to understand the complexity. Out of the complexity comes still the story of the greatest country on earth, with lots of problems and mistakes we've made and lots of things we've got to do better. But it is a wholly positive story, and that's the one I've been telling. And guess what? The numbers we have are not because only certain group of people watch it. It's because everybody watches it.
You make documentaries that are watched in red and blue America for sure. Do you worry at all about being critical of things like conservative policies on restricting history and how that might affect your films or the reception of them?
I think there's kind of left policies that restrict history too, and free speech. So what you want is just a free and open discussion of what actually happened. I'm not worried about criticizing. I mean, I've read the Declaration and I've read the Constitution. So I know what our pole star is. So if we're failing it, it doesn't really matter where it comes from. You just want to call out the fraudulence whenever it is. When somebody's trying to convince you that it was only this thing, you can say, well, that's actually not true, and here's the evidence of it.
You talked about looking at the whole of history and the importance of that in the story it tells. Before we go, at risk of begging you to make this more uplifting, I am curious, as somebody who thinks about the broad scope of history, what you would say to people who are worried about where the country is right now, who feel like we're in a broken time. What has history shown you about the country's capacity to heal itself?
Well, you just answered your own question. And we are way more divided during our revolution. It's not us fighting an enemy 3,000 miles across the way. We're fighting ourselves. Our revolution is more of a civil war than our Civil War was. And the Civil War was section against section. We use the term brother against brother. It's more aptly applied to the American Revolution. We were more divided in our Civil War period. We're more divided in the period after Civil War, a subject of a film I'm working on now called Reconstruction, the most misunderstood series. We're really divided during Vietnam. So I think that there's a kind of essential narcissism that is embodied in journalism. Oh, this is the most important time and therefore the worst or the best or whatever it is. And we can be drowning in our own superlatives or our own self-pity or worry or whatever. History has a kind of optimism to it because you get perspectives. A friend of mine came up in the financial services, came up to me after the 2008 meltdown in the fall of 2008 and said, we're in a depression. And I just looked at him, having studied the Depression in many films, and said, in the Depression, in many cities, the animals in the zoo were shot and the meat distributed to the poor. When that happens, I'll agree that we're in a depression. And all that did is just, I don't know whether that's optimistic or whatever, but it does allow an exhalation. Get over yourself. And if you're in a fetal position worried about this, get up and do something. And we have certain rights that permit us to change if you do not like what's going on.
All right. Well, that's a great note to end on. Get up and do something indeed. Thank you so much, Ken Burns. I really appreciate you coming on the show.
Thank you. My pleasure.
College Matters from the Chronicle is a production of the Chronicle of Higher Education, the nation's leading independent newsroom covering colleges. If you like the show, please leave us a review or invite a friend to listen. And remember to follow on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcast so that you never miss an episode. You can find an archive of every episode, all of our show notes, and much more at chronicle.com/College Matters. If you'd like, drop us a note at collegematters@chronicle.com. We are produced by Rococo Punch. Our Chronicle producer is Fernanda Zamudio Suarez. Our podcast artwork is by Cottrell Thomas. Special thanks to our colleagues Brock Reed, Joshua Hatch, Jillian Atelsik, Sarah Brown, Ron Coddington, Scott Seymour, Carmen Mendoza, and all of the people at the Chronicle who make this show possible. I'm Jack Stripling. Thanks for listening.